The Egyptians learning to work stone was not the result of a sudden discovery. This knowledge took shape through long years spent along the banks of the Nile River, careful observation, and repeated experience. Each year, the Nile flooded and receded. It brought fertility, but also destruction. Houses made of mudbrick had to be repaired after every flood, and wooden structures quickly decayed under sun and humidity. In contrast, the rocky outcrops along the riverbanks remained in place, unaffected by the seasons. Stone, silently yet insistently, demonstrated what permanence was. For the early Egyptians, stone was not yet a consciously chosen building material. Stones that had naturally broken off, rolled, or cracked in nature were collected and used for daily needs. These stones were roughly shaped, often breaking, or behaving differently than expected. Yet every failed attempt left behind new knot. Gradually, it became clear which stone cracked easily and which resisted impact. Limestone was relatively soft and suitable for shaping. Granite, on the other hand, demanded patience with its hardness and did not forgive haste. Over time, stone ceased to be merely a material and became a standard. What was durable was sacred. What was permanent was valuable. This idea did not remain limited to architecture. It also reflected on the understanding of death. For a person living in a temporary world, the idea of leaving a lasting trace gained importance. Stone was the natural bearer of this desire. When a structure was built of stone, it spoke not only to the present, but also to the future. As this awareness grew, people began not only to use stone as they found it, they turned to searching for it, selecting it, and understanding it. Thus, stone began a slow but irreversible journey toward the center of Egyptian civilization. Once the permanence of stone was recognized, leaving it to chance was no longer sufficient. Fallen or broken stones were limited and did not meet every need. At this point, people turned toward the source of stone itself. Quarries emerged in this way, yet they did not open all at once as planned mining areas. They expanded gradually by following natural cracks, fissures, and layers. Egyptian stoneworkers learned to examine stone before cutting it. Vines on the rock surface, changes in color, and natural fracture lines were carefully observed. The aim was not to force the stone, but to understand where it wanted to separate. This approach would later allow large blocks to be extracted with almost no error. The tools used were simple, but suited to their purpose. Chisels made of copper were insufficient on their own against hard stone. Therefore, they were used together with stone hammers. Wooden wedges were placed into cracks and then soaked with water. As the wood swelled, the rock slowly separated. This method required time rather than strength. A process that lasted days could end with a single mistake. Working in quarries was as much a mental effort as a physical one. The master had to be able to read the stone and know where to stop. For this reason, stone craftsmanship became a respected skill in Egyptian society. One who understood stone was seen as one who understood nature. The stones extracted from the quarries were not yet building materials. Their surfaces were irregular and unmeasured. Therefore, stone working areas emerged. Surfaces were beaten with round stone hammers called dolerite pounders, and protrusions were removed. This process was a patience-demanding ritual. With every blow, the stone became a little flatter, gradually becoming compatible with the human hand. Sand was indispensable at this stage. Copper saws and chisels could be effective on hard stone, when used together with sand. Sand was an invisible but decisive tool. It completed what metal could not do. Thus, the Egyptians learned to surpass material limitations. As this technical knowledge developed, stone became not only durable, but also a shapeable element. This transformation was one of the most important steps that opened the way for architecture. Extracting and roughly shaping stone was not enough for the Egyptians. The real problem was being able to combine this heavy and hard material within an order. Stones could be stacked, but lack of measurement weakened the structure. At this point, the idea of measure became an inseparable part of stonework. Measure was not merely a practical need, but an intellectual necessity. The unit of measurement, called the cubit, was standardized during this period. Although based on the human arm, it was not random. Royal cubits were specially defined, and craftsmen took this measure as their basis. Thus, the work done by different teams could be compatible with one another. Measure went beyond individual skill and formed a common language. To ensure vertical accuracy, the plumb line was used. A string with a weight attached to its end took gravity itself as its guide. This simple tool guaranteed the verticality of walls and the correctness of corners. For horizontal planes, ropes were stretched and directions were determined with stakes. Before the stone was even moved, the structure was built in the mind. This technical order was directly related to the concept of Ma'at in Egyptian thought. Ma'at meant the balance of the universe, truth, and order. A poorly measured structure was not merely an aesthetic error, but a flaw against the cosmic order. For this reason, masters of measurement were not only craftsmen, but also guardians of order. At this stage, stonework began to turn into architecture. Stones were no longer piled randomly. They were placed within specific proportions. Wall thicknesses, openings, and corners were calculated. These calculations were not based on written formulas, but on proportional knowledge formed through experience. The master weighed the stone in his hand, evaluated it by sight, and weighted when necessary. In this process, architecture went beyond individual mastery. Knowledge became transferable. Masters taught apprentices not only how to strike, but also when to stop. Working with stone rewarded patience, not haste. Thus, stone became not only a building material, but also a teacher of discipline. This discipline would soon open the way for monumental thinking. When measure, order, and stone craftsmanship reached a certain maturity, this knowledge had to be tested at some point. This test occurred during the reign of Pharaoh Djoser of the Third Dynasty. Imhotep, who served in Djoser's court, was not only an architect, but also a physician, priest, and thinker. What set him apart was his courage to bring together existing knowledge and apply it on a scale never before attempted. Until that time, monumental tombs were built of mudbrick. Stone was a limited and complementary material. Imhotep broke this tradition. The pharaoh's tomb would be entirely of stone. This decision was not only an architectural revolution, but also an intellectual one, because stone symbolized permanence. The pharaoh's existence would continue after death. The step pyramid at Saqqara was not a flawless structure designed all at once. The initial plan was a lower mastaba. However, during construction, the structure was enlarged, layers were added, and it turned into a stepped form. Each new layer tested the limits of the previous one. The behavior of stone was observed, and mistakes were corrected without being concealed. This structure was learning turned into stone. Imhotep's achievement was not merely that he built a pyramid. He proved that Thinking on a large scale with stone was possible. Walls were smoother, corners clearer. Measure and proportion became decisive for the first time. Stone was no longer a temporary solution, but the essence of architecture. During this period, labor also became more organized. Stonemasons, surveyors, and carriers took on separate roles. This specialization reduced errors. Architecture began to move from individual mastery to collective knowledge. The step pyramid was a starting point for later generations. Imhotep's name was remembered for centuries and was even deified because he had taught not only how to cut stone, but how to think with it. The path opened by Imhotep did not offer a ready-made recipe for those who came after him. Stone architecture was now possible, but how to do it better had not yet been settled. This uncertainty was clearly seen during the reign of Pharaoh Snefru, the founder of the Fourth Dynasty. Snefru became one of the pharaohs who commissioned the most pyramids in Egyptian history, but this number was a sign not of perfection, but of searching. Snefru's first major attempt was the Midim Pyramid. Initially designed as a step structure, it was later intended to be transformed into a smooth-sided pyramid. However, the load-bearing calculations had not been fully established. The outer casing collapsed, leaving the structure in its present unfinished state. This was the first major failure of Egyptian architecture, but at the same time, one of its most valuable lessons. This lesson is clearly seen in the bent pyramid. During construction, the pyramid's angle was changed. The lower section is steeper, the upper section more shallow. This change was not a mistake, but a conscious correction. The weight and pressure of the stone were read correctly, and the structure was saved. The bent pyramid is the clearest proof that the Egyptians adapted to stone, rather than stubbornly opposing it. Snefru's third major structure is the Red Pyramid. Here, everything learned from previous mistakes was applied. The angle is more balanced, the stones more orderly, and the structure was successfully completed. This pyramid is accepted as the first example of the true pyramid in the classical sense. During this process, engineering knowledge quietly matured. The slope of ramps, the dimensions of stone blocks, and the distribution of internal spaces were carefully calculated. Levers were used not so much for major lifting operations, but for fine adjustments. Stone blocks were transported on sledges. The ground was wetted to reduce friction. Although the wheel was known, it was understood that it was not suitable for heavy loads and soft ground, and it was deliberately not preferred. The reign of Snefru became a period not of success, but of learning. Errors were not hidden. They remained on the stone. This transparency would allow the next generation to go much further. The experience gained during Snefru's reign left a strong legacy to Khufu, the next pharaoh of the Fourth Dynasty. The Great Pyramid that Khufu had built on the Giza Plateau was not the sudden achievement of a single genius, but the natural result of knowledge accumulated over generations. This structure emerged as the most mature expression of Egyptian stone architecture. The plan of the Great Pyramid shows how far measure and proportion had advanced. The base sides form an almost perfect square. The corners are aligned with the cardinal directions, with astonishing accuracy. This accuracy was achieved not by chance or mystery, but through ropes, plumb lines, star observations, and repeated measurements. Mathematics here was not an abstract science, but an applied discipline. For a long time, those who worked on this enormous structure were depicted as slaves. However, archaeological findings refute this idea. Worker villages found near Giza show a labor community that was regularly fed, housed, and provided with medical care. Workers were mostly employed during the Nile flood season when fields were underwater. This was seen not as forced labor, but as service to the state and the pharaoh. The workforce was tightly organized. Stone masons, carriers, surveyors, and administrators took on different roles. This specialization reduced errors and increased efficiency. After being extracted from the quarry, stone blocks were transported to the site by following specific routes. The Nile functioned as a natural transportation route in this process. Placing the blocks required delicate adjustment rather than brute force. Small levers were used not for major lifting but for final placement. With the help of wedges and sand, stones were brought together without damaging each other. The aim was not to force the stones together, but to achieve harmony by distributing the load evenly. The Great Pyramid was not merely a tomb. It was the monumentalized form of thinking with stone, building with measure, and collective intelligence. After this structure, Egyptian architecture knew what it was capable of. When the Great Pyramid was completed, Egypt now knew what was possible with stone. From this point on, the issue was not building larger structures, but applying the acquired knowledge to different areas. The pyramids were a peak, but also a turning point, because after a structure of this scale, architectural thinking changed direction. During the 5th and 6th dynasties, pyramids continued to be built, but quality and scale changed. This was not due to a loss of knowledge, but a conscious choice. Instead of gigantic tombs, temple complexes, ceremonial causeways in the valleys, and sun temples came to the fore. Stone craftsmanship was no longer concentrated on a single structure, but created a spatial whole. During this period, obelisks emerged. These monuments, carved from single pieces of stone, demonstrated the level stone craftsmanship had reached. Extracting, transporting, and erecting an obelisk required a different sensitivity than pyramid blocks. Here, levers were used more effectively, yet wheels were again avoided. For a long, narrow, and heavy stone, wheeled systems were risky. Instead, sledges, lubricated surfaces, and controlled inclines were preferred. By the time of the New Kingdom, stone architecture turned toward rock-cut tombs. In the Valley of the Kings, tombs were now underground. This was not the abandonment of pyramid knowledge, but rather its transformation into a more sophisticated form. Instead of piling stone upward, it was necessary to carve it in a controlled manner. Measure was decisive here as well. The slope of corridors, the layout of chambers, and ceiling loads were carefully calculated. Temple architecture became the longest-lasting field of application for stone knowledge. In vast complexes such as Karnak and Luxor, stone was not only structural, but narrative. Reliefs, inscriptions, and columns represented the point where architecture merged with thought. The measurement techniques used in these structures were a direct continuation of the methods developed during the Pyramid period. When the pyramids ended, stone craftsmanship did not. On the contrary, it matured. The Egyptians had become a civilization that no longer conquered stone, but spoke with it.